Thank you very much, Clarence. Nuncio put many questions and challenges, and hopefully during our discussion or during our talks during the symposium, maybe we'll find some answers. So, as we are going to start and listen to the first keynote speaker, Father Clarence, I would like to say a few words about him. So I was a privilege to drive him around Port Moresby, and I said, "Oh, that's that's from Malaysia. That's from Malaysia. That's from," and I saw that he was growing up. And he's from Malaysia. He was born in Kuala Lumpur, and he's a priest of Kuala Lumpur diocese. But he sent his CV finally, so we will finish at lunch. So I will just make a few points. So he made all his studies mostly in Rome. In Rome he made a bachelor, a licentiate, a doctorate in theology, and so very much he's involved in Rome. So now at the moment he is employed in the Catholic Research Center in Kuala Lumpur. So he was working in the diocese, teaching in the seminaries. So he too was a columnist, writing in the different newspapers, thesis examinators, editor, panel speakers. So he wrote so many articles about the mission to make disciples in Asia. What else? Ethical and theological implication for green living, or turning our parish into islands of mercy. So many other things. The big presentation papers at conferences, seminars too. He was dealing with moral prophetic role of new evangelization in the digital age. So we will talk about this too, human dignity of human person and ethical issues in genetics and all kinds of things. If you want to speak to him, he's speaking Italian, of course English, Tamil, what else, Malay, French, Spanish. You can speak to him later in the country. So with all this, so he's well equipped and well prepared for this talk. So please welcome Father Clarence.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Your Eminence, Excellencies, Bishops, Archbishops, brothers and sisters. Don't be fooled by the CV. Okay, there was just a thing that I sent to help Father Valentine know a little bit about me. First and foremost, I would like to take this occasion to thank the organizers of the symposium for having invited me. You know, one of the things that I've discovered is that people often ask, you know, what is it that a foreigner could offer, a different context, a different landscape in the area of mission. in the next 2 days, most of you will be discussing a little bit about the context of mission here in Papua New Guinea and in the Solomon Islands. And I come from a very different reality. And what I hope to be able to offer for the discussion is the why of mission, and not so much about the how, because the how comes from the ground. It comes from the people who are reflecting, who are talking, who are discerning as to how mission is most appropriate in a particular context. And so I come from a different context, and I hope that my contribution to this symposium would offer you a little framework, a little guide as to how we can look at mission, especially in this time when the Holy Father has called for an extraordinary month of mission. Here in PNG, you are celebrating a month. In my own country, we have extended it and made it an extraordinary missionary year. So we are going through a whole year of reflecting and discerning about mission. I would like to just begin by showing you an outline of what I will present. Now, I have a little bit close to an hour to speak, and I hope not to bore you or to put you to sleep, but at least to be able to engage with you in a conversation. So this is my general outline. I do a little bit of an introduction, a bit of a biblical mandate to relook at mission. And I've been asked to look at the last 100 years in terms of important church documents with regard to mission. And I would like to be able to draw some key points. Now, it is not possible in an hour to be able to go through all the documents in the last 100 years. We will have to have a whole week together to be able to go through them. So I'm just going to pick up some key points to help us in our reflections. I would like to see some paradigm movements in the documents, some changes that one could see, especially with regard to emphasis. And if we do have time, I would like to just offer some of my thoughts about how can we move ahead with regard to mission in this part of the world, and some conclusion. I hope you're okay with that. Anybody with violent objections about the scheme? All right. I would like to begin, as I said earlier, I come from a very different context, okay, from what most of you are accustomed to. Sorry. Economically, socioculturally, geopolitically, demographically, we are quite different, okay? And you may wonder, what is it that I can contribute significantly to this effort that you are taking? Now, this is where I come from. Just a little bit of my own background that helps you to see the lens that I am looking through, because that will also come with some biases because of where I come from and how I look at things. And I leave it to you to appropriate what is most appealing to you. Now, this is where I come from. This is Malaysia. We have two parts of Malaysia. This is the peninsular part of Malaysia, which is connected in the north to Thailand, and right in the south, as the country that you know most probably is Singapore. They are our arch rivals. Any Singaporeans here? All right, okay, yeah. So we'll have an interesting discussion afterwards. Yeah. So this neighboring countries, we always have this little thing about when it comes to sports and many other things. And this is where we are. Okay. Yeah. So at least you know where I come from. Having been here the last 2 days, I'm quite ashamed to say that I come from Malaysia because of some of the connotations or the sins of my forefathers here in Papua New Guinea. But you know, let me tell you, not all Malaysians are like that. There's some nice ones too, and I'm one of them. But there's one reality that we need to be aware of. Now, this is the statistics that I was able to find, and I think for Papua New Guinea, the closest I could find was 2011. My background is this. I come from a place where Christians are a minority. We are just 9.2%. And Catholics probably will be half of that, just below 5%. 61 or 62% would be Muslims. That is my background. But I'm coming here to a place where 80% are Christians. So you need to understand the dynamics are quite different with regard to mission that we are talking about. It's very different when one looks at mission, when one is a minority, when one is limited by so many parameters about how you can express mission, to another place where it is quite open and it is quite acceptable. But there's one reality that we all share, and I think you will agree with me, and that is the faith that we have received, the Christian faith that we have received, has come from another part of the world. I think that is the reality that we share. Whether it was the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the British, the French, we realize that it is a faith that has been handed or brought to our lands. And that is the common reality that we all share in. Pope Francis has asked for an extraordinary missionary month. In other words, the church invites us to this direction, to look at being baptized and sent. In other words, it is extraordinary because it is something different. But perhaps we need to be clear in our minds that what is extraordinary? It is not the mission that is extraordinary. The mission is quite ordinary to what we believe in. But it is the period of time that we are being asked to make it extraordinary for our reflection, for our discernment too. So one is to remember that mission itself is not extraordinary, because it is the foundational nature and the characteristic of the church. As we all know very well, and from our own theological studies, the church exists for mission. Therefore, it's a very simple, logical deduction. If there is no mission, there is no church. And there can be no church if there is no mission. A very simple conclusion that one can make. And so, this is what Pope Francis is calling for, and we already heard Father Valentine being part of it. And he's asking that during this extraordinary missionary month, we need to revive the missionary awareness and commitment. The missionary awareness and commitment. And this is what we are calling to. Apart from celebrating the centenary of the apostolic letter, Maximum Illud of Pope Benedict XV. Far too often, mission is seen through the lens of some form of activity, or I like the words of Pope Francis. It is not like a product to sell. So very often when we think of mission, we think, okay, what programs can we initiate? What programs can we bring in order to bring our people to a greater missionary awareness? And I think it's a very important and very key thing that he says. It is not a product to sell. It's not something that you have that you want to sell. But rather, it finds its origins in the missionary command of Jesus, which we all are very familiar with, right at the end of Matthew's Gospel. And I think we've already heard that passage being read to us. The perspective that I want to offer you this morning is that mission cannot just be reduced to some form of activity, or a cluster of activities, or programs, or models, but rather the identification of mission must come from the very nature of the existence of the church. If mission is reduced only to some form of activities, then we can quite easily miss out the core dimension of what mission is. And for me, mission is essentially relational. And that is, in fact, forms the core nature of the church. And this is something that earlier already Father Valentine projected. And Pope Francis says, the missionary mandate touches us personally. I am a mission, you are a mission. Every baptized man and woman is a mission. So anthropologically, there is a basis of mission that you and I are mission. And it is not just in the activities, it is not just in the programs that we run. Which simply means that missionary activity is not something foreign or something distant or alien to the human person. It is bound up to our own human nature. That's what we have in the Second Vatican Council. That it is bound up to our very existence, which bears the mark both of man's sin and God's blessings. Despite the fact that we are weak, we fail, we also carry the grace of God in each one of us. And so we must be transformed for the greater glory of God. And so if it is bound up to human nature, then I would trace, in that second instance, is that there is a biblical mandate for mission. Far too often, when we ask anyone, can you give me a scripture quotation for mission, we will all quickly run to which particular passage would be? Matthew 28. Go, make disciples, baptize, and teach. But I think there is something more foundational that we want to look at. That mission already finds its origins in creation. If we look at how each individual is a mission to the world by virtue of being the fruit of God's love, then mission itself finds its origins in the beginning, in creation itself. In the Old Testament, when we read about God creating Adam and Eve, or God creating the universe and finally Adam and Eve, God gave them a mission. And what is it? To be stewards. To be stewards of each other, to be stewards of oneself, and to be stewards of all that God has created. So the mission is very clear that it is fundamentally required by God by the fact that you and I have been created in His image and likeness. That's the very basis of mission that we want to find. One of the reasons as to why God entrusted the care of creation to man and woman is because we have been created in His image and likeness. Simply means that God has now established a relationship between man and woman. On the basis of this relationship is what mission rests. The biblical commentators would call this the covenantal relationship. So the whole Old Testament is the journey of the people of God. It's a journey of people of God being faithful to the covenantal relationship. And that is at the very core of the mission that each one of us, we are called to. Sometimes in that journey, this reminder was made gently, as you will read in the Old Testament, and sometimes they were reminded quite dramatically also. So whichever way it had been done, the core message always points to a covenantal relationship between God and humanity. And so that is the very basis of mission that we are talking about. Very quickly, I move to the New Testament, and this is just an overview. Mission is often associated with the great mandate that Jesus gave His disciples. Matthew 28. Go therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. But Jesus gave His disciples, Jesus gave His disciples 4 tasks. Go, make disciples, baptize, and teach. 4 tasks that are not in one continuum. They could be 4 different tasks that Jesus offers or asked of his disciples. In other words, if we are looking at mission from a biblical perspective, it is also important that we look at the other biblical passages which are often left isolated in the context of mission. And I think it's very important. And I think there are 3 other Gospels that we also need to make reference to when we are speaking about mission. And I want to look at them. Very quickly, look at Mark's Gospel. Jesus begins his ministry just after the baptism, and he comes out with this particular message. The time is fulfilled. The kingdom of God is at hand. And that is the start of Jesus' mission. Luke's Gospel, we all know this, Jesus going back to the temple to read that passage that was given to him from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord has been given upon me. And he goes on and on. And thirdly, it is John's Gospel where it says, as the Father sent me, I am sending you. And I think this is the key to understanding mission. As the Father sent me, now I am sending you. What does this mean? The missionary command of Jesus as seen in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John must be seen in relation to Jesus' own mission. What was his mission? And that is what we are called to continue. If you look at John's Gospel, as the Father sent me, I am now sending you. In other words, the same mission that the Father gives Jesus, now Jesus gives it out to each other. So with this little background of understanding what mission or why mission in a biblical perspective, I would like to just have a kind of an overview of the last 100 years. Despite my thinning and graying hair, I'm not very old. I'm not 100 years old. And definitely I have not, I was conceived after Vatican II. So I'm still quite young actually. But my looks kind of give me away to make me look old. But the 100 years that we are looking at is the centenary celebration. And I would like to look at it as what are the key points that these documents talk about in relation to mission. It is not possible for us in this short time to be able to go in detail all the documents that were issued from 1919 right up to 2019. But I have made a selection only. I've just chosen 12 documents. I'm quite biblical, so I think the number 12 is quite biblical. So I've just taken 12 documents which I think are important. You can add many other documents. Some documents I will not make reference to. It is not because that they are not important, but in the way that I've chosen to make this presentation, these 12 documents serve me a particular purpose and also the intention of this presentation. And so, in the last 100 years, I've been asked to look at what are the changes, what shifts can we see. And I think that the mission of the church has not changed for 2,000 years. It has not changed. The mission, as stated in the gospel, is very clear. It is to continue the mission of Jesus Christ. However, what has changed? The context. The context that we live in has changed. And the mission that we are called to would be seen from the perspective of the changing context and the landscape and that we live in. So looking at the important pronouncements over these years, it is clear the church does not only have a mission, but the church is missionary by its very existence. By its very nature, the church is mission. So each moment in history provides the church with an opportunity to respond to the changing realities. As I said, in the interest of time, I've just taken 12 key papal documents that relate to mission. And in choosing these 12, I had to leave out some other documents which you may consider important. But it is not a deliberate attempt to disregard some of the other documents. Let me very quickly go to the very centenary document that we are celebrating, Maximum Evil, on the propagation of faith throughout the world. It came out in 1919, just after the wake of the conflict of World War I. Pope Benedict XV recognized that the church needs an evangelical approach to missionary work in the world. One has to remember that at the beginning of that century, that after the war, it is also a time when many countries are slowly beginning to ask for independence. The start already in the beginning of that century. That we realize that this document seeks to explain the reasoning why he writes the letter. In other words, it is encouraging the bishops, the priests, to a renewed commitment in the task of evangelization. And very quickly, what are the key points that this particular document presents? It talks about, firstly, it invites the training of missionaries. The training of missionaries. In other words, Pope Benedict XV was concerned about the fate of the church in developing countries because he sensed already, as I said, the first stirrings of the call for independence. And so, it needed missionaries and it needed people to train indigenous clergy so that indigenous clergy can take up mission of the different places. So, the call for that momentous moment, as the document is named after, a call to relook at how mission can continue, especially when countries are beginning to have their independence and separate from colonial powers. One would understand that many of the faiths, or the Christian faith that we have received, it came together with the expansion of the Christendom that started off from the west, that moved towards the east. Like in Malaysia, the first missionaries came to Malaysia, they were from Portugal in the 16th century. So the expansion of the Portuguese kingdom came along with it also the Christian faith. So once this separation is beginning to take place, this document is speaking about how mission is going to continue in these places apart from the colonial powers. So the training of indigenous clergy, training of local clergy who will take up spiritual leadership of the people was an important reflection in this particular document. Let's move very quickly. Rerum Ecclesiae, the renewing of the church. Once again, we see that Pope Pius XI, he was talking about local clergy, together with founding and also to help the emerging churches. Not only there was an appeal to organizations to help support mission, but there was also to see a possibility of how local clergy together, and now this is something new we see, together with catechists, religious, be trained for the future of the church and of the country. So we are looking at about after approximately 7-8 years after Maximum Illud, that Pope Pius XI is once again emphasizing on the need to train local clergy. 25 years after Maximum Illud, I'm going to make a big jump. 25 years, once again, Pope Pius XII, in marking the 25th anniversary of Rerum Ecclesiae, apart from acknowledging that there had been a steady growth of the number of local clergy, so you begin to realize that in that span from 1919 and now in the 50s, that missionary activities have been focused on the training of local clergy. He recognizes that there has been a growth in the number of local clergy. And now he begins to say that let not the gospel on being introduced into any new land destroy or extinguish whatever its people possess that is naturally good, just, or beautiful. Okay? Do not act like one who recklessly cuts down and uproots the thriving forest. Okay, now you understand what this document talks about. Nothing to do with Malaysia, okay? The cutting down of forests. So the key theme that you see in this particular document is this, is the formation of new Christians. The formation of new Christians. If it had been talking about in the last 25, 30 years about the formation of local clergy, now we begin to see a little shift on the mission of the church, and it talks about the training of lay people through associations in order to bring the faith to all peoples. Today we talk about ecclesial movements, but in the 50s we're talking about associations, different associations that were already in existence in many parts of the world for the lay people to participate and to be able to empower them and to give them the direction also. In 1957, the fourth document that I picked up, it would be Fidei Donum. Okay, Fidei Donum, many of you know. Any Fidei Donum priests here? Do we have? We have. Yeah, we should be there. Okay. So you know the birth of it. Okay. So if prior to 1957, the focus of the church had been on the Far East. Okay. Now this encyclical letter of Pope Pius XII, now it looks at a different situation. The emerging churches, especially in Africa, where independence movements were beginning to flourish. The need to have indigenous clergies and also foreign missionaries who had been at work, and rather than and missionary efforts in Africa and other parts of the world. So it's a gift of faith, the gift of faith, where people could share to go to other places to go on mission. And it was looking at especially the emerging churches in Africa. The fifth document that I've chosen would be Princeps Pastorum, the Prince of the Shepherds. Once again, it talks about mission. It talks about mission. It talks about native clergy or local clergy. It speaks about lay participation. This is 1959. So it is the 40th anniversary. So you notice that Maximum Ilud has been celebrated quite a number of times in the past 100 years. So in the past 40 years, the primary mission of the church had been to establish local churches, local hierarchy, clergy in mission regions. The Pope in this document provides some directives for the local clergy and also for missionaries on what is necessary in these emerging young churches. And I'd like to emphasize those words, emerging young churches that we are looking at. Okay? He talks about collaboration between local clergy and expatriate missionaries. He speaks about priestly holiness, the need for all clergy to study missiology, the importance of schools, cultural centers, the employment of modern techniques to spread the faith. Today we are talking about new techniques that we have appropriated for our times, but already we're talking about the end of the 50s, talking about new techniques to spread the faith. And also the role of the laity. The role of the laity. Interestingly, this encyclical also notes that in many of these mission places, they are now governed by their own ecclesial authority or hierarchy. So local bishops are beginning to grow also at the beginning of the 60s. Then we come to this document which is quoted very often, okay? Agentis. Okay, as I said, I'm a product after, and this is where much of it has been put in a very systematic way of what it means with regard to the missionary activity of the church. The starting point for Agentis is this. In number 3, the Lord preached that one time, and what was wrought in him for the saving of the human race must be spread abroad and published to the ends of the earth. So if you see the relation here, it's very closely related to the missionary activity or the biblical mandate that we look at. What Jesus did is what we are called to do and what we are called to continue. Therefore, the Council stresses the importance of the need for missionary work that extends between the first coming of Jesus and the second coming of Jesus. So, we have a wide range here from the beginning and to the end. The council concludes its chapter on the first principles by describing the church's missionary activity, nothing else, nothing less than an epiphany. In other words, the missionary activity of the church is the manifesting of God's presence in the world. How God works in the history of salvation. So missionary activity tends towards a finality, that eschatological end that we talk about. But this decree also acknowledges that the landscape we are living in is changing. In the present, I quote, in the present state of affairs, out of which there is arising a new situation for mankind, the church, being the salt and the light of the world, is called more urgently to save and renew every creature, that all things may be restored in Christ, and all men, and I will add women, may constitute one family in Him, one people of God. And so this is something that, we often quote. We talk about the missionary nature of the church, the very existence of the church. It comes from the Second Vatican Council, that we are called to save and to renew every creature. 10 years after Argentis, Evangelii Nuntiandi of Pope Paul VI. 10 years after Argentis, in a nutshell, what he is asking, he acknowledges also, within a span of 10 years, that the world has changed. The world has changed tremendously, and therefore, the church needs to re-look. So what we are doing now has been done also by our predecessors, to re-look into how to evangelize, how to proclaim the gospel message, to see Christ as the author of all missionary activities. Now this is very important, that Christ is the author of all missionary activities. And all Christians, all of us, we are agents. We are agents of this. And he says that the call to evangelize is a personal command of Jesus. It's a personal command of Jesus. So Evangelii Nuntiandi is very practical, very down to earth in approaching evangelization. It talks about, now this is where the language slowly begins to change. We hear things like language that is so common that we use today, but in the 70s, they were quite new in terms of to witness Christian life as part of evangelization. Then it also emphasizes on preaching. So if you notice that what comes before preaching is witnessing. Witnessing comes before preaching in the way it is presented in this particular document. Then he talks about mass media. Of course, the 70s is slowly beginning to grow. Personal contact, sacraments, popular piety. Popular piety is another way that he talks about. And also proclaiming the gospel. In other words, we begin to see that the emphasis now from, as I would bring to your attention afterwards, the emphasis of training missionaries, clergy, religious, now it's slowly moving towards everyone is called to participate actively in the mission of the church. Everyone. So it's not a select group of people, and not only people who go to Catholic theological institutes who are called to mission. So there is a slight movement, a slight change in terms of direction. Are you still with me, or have I put you to sleep already? I'm not too sure. Do we need a coffee break now? No. No, I'm just joking. I'm not worried. So moving on to something that probably, I think by 1990, looking around, most of us are born already. And maybe still not born after 1990, born after the 90s, I look around here. So we all. So I moved to Redemptoris Missio of Pope John Paul II. This is his 8th encyclical. And he focuses now on the urgency of evangelization, the missionary evangelization. Okay? And he says that faith is strengthened when it is given to others. So once again, if Jesus is the author, he once again reminds the church that the Holy Spirit is the principal agent of the church's mission. The Holy Spirit, okay? As it can be seen in the early church. We know the whole Pentecost experience, how they were all empowered by the Spirit and went out on this great missionary journey. Even though freedom of religion is emphasized, it says that yes, we still have a duty to take part in the mission of the church. And it's quite an interesting quote that he has. And I kind of like this. He says, the church proposes, but never imposes. You propose, but never impose. I think it's quite a nice caption for us to remember, especially when we are in mission. In this sense, the idea of Christian witnessing is becoming more and more pronounced in the missionary documents of the church. In number 42, it says, the witness of a good Christian life is the first and irreplaceable form of mission. Witness of Christian life is the first and irreplaceable form of mission. And so this document now opens a new pathway for understanding the Catholic Church's interaction with other religions in a larger world. So together with these, the development of peoples, inculturation of faith, communications, media, and evangelization is being discussed in his document. Okay, this is now coming more to the beginning of a new century, a new millennium. Novo Millenium Innuente. This is 2001. So at the turn of the century, at the end of the Great Jubilee in the year 2000, he provides the church with a direction. Now we are entering into a new period, a new millennium. And many of you will remember these words, Duc in alto. That was the word that was being used during that time. Put into the deep. It is given out to every baptized Christian, the call to follow Jesus. Not just to follow him, but to take part in his mission. The deep water that we are asked to put out into the new millennium and the catch we are going to bring in order to result in a new evangelization. What is noteworthy in this particular document is that we are being invited to reflect the light of Christ in different historical periods and to see how the face of Jesus can shine in the new millennium. So he is calling for a great discernment, and not so much as to putting directions and plans, but in this document, if you begin to read the undertones of this particular document, the way I read it, it's asking for us to discern, to pray, and to see what the new millennium is asking of each one of us. Now, this next one will probably be closer to your heart. Ecclesia in Oceania. And I think this is a very important document, and I would humbly agree that probably you have studied it more than I have, because my context is Ecclesia in Asia, which I have read and studied. But I've just been able to pick up some key things that I think is important to mention in a gathering like this, especially when you are in this beautiful part of the world. As Father Giorgio sent me a text message, I asked him, is Papa really part of Oceania? He said, yes, it's the best part of the world. And he said, so I take his word for it. That's gospel truth, I believe. And I think what this particular document is asking is to find new ways in presenting the gospel to the peoples of Oceania, the Jesus as Lord and Savior. And I think this is very important. Finding new and appropriate ways. And this is what I hope that this symposium would eventually come up with. New and appropriate ways. The document acknowledges there are challenges. There are challenges. Some of the challenges that are being mentioned is with the traditional religions, the cultures, secularization, the impact of social media. It is all calling for finding creative ways. And this is a word that we begin to hear in the vocabulary of Pope Francis. Finding creative ways in responding to these new churches. What I can say is that Ecclesia in Oceania puts forth that the proclamation of the truth, not only in words, but also in action. Not just in words, but in action. Therefore, I just want to quote this particular text. The church regards the social apostolate as an integral part of her evangelizing mission. The upliftment or the human development. And I think this is quite important in terms of looking at the church's social doctrines, that the upliftment of human life is also an integral part of the church's evangelizing mission. The contribution to human development, the promotion of human rights, the defense of human life and dignity, social justice, the protection of the environment. It also speaks about the church's remarkable contribution, as I've already heard in this last couple of days, in the area of education and healthcare. So I think we begin to see that there is now in Ecclesia and Oceania, there is a great interplay, or there is a convergence between the church's mission as traditionally understood as proclaiming the gospel, and also the social mission of the church. There is a point of convergence between those two. And I think that's the very important one. Now, the blueprint of Pope Francis, this is his direction for the church. Evangelii Gaudium. 10 minutes. Now, I'm sure this is something that we all have read already, and it's being quoted and being mentioned. And I just want to highlight two important points. Pope Francis has a dream, not one similar to Martin Luther King, who said, I have a dream. His dream is, I dream of a missionary option for the church. A missionary option for the church. Many of you who studied theology in the 70s, 80s, 90s also, many of you will remember one of the key words that is associated with the word option is always the word, the poor. The option for the poor was the direction of the church, very much also in our parts of the world. But he's introduced something very revolutionary, the missionary option of the church. And for this, we need missionary disciples in the church. The word missionary disciple appears 9 times in this particular document. That the church needs missionary disciples, all the baptized, whatever their position in the church, whatever their levels of instruction in their faith, whether kindergarten, preschool, or wherever, everyone is an agent of evangelization and has to be a part of the great mission of the church. Evangelization is not just for professionals, not just for people who attend symposiums, but it belongs to every person, all the faithful, every baptized member. I think that's very important in Evangelii Gaudium. Now, between Evangelii Gaudium and the next document that I want to talk about is Gaudete et Exsultate, but holiness. There were 3 other things there were 2 other things that came up. That would be Amoris Laetitia, and also we're talking about Laudato Si. Laudato Si. And I think I have not included them, but they are very specific, but I will just take them in the implications. Very quickly, let me just go to Gaudete and Exsultate on the key points, is that spiritual holiness that one is called to is that call to be a witness, and that is a fruit of that holiness. So what is important in this document is that holiness is not so much about a personal salvific event, but the holiness is about bearing witness to others. So there is a great missionary dimension in the whole idea of the holiness that Pope Francis is calling. And he's saying that in following Jesus, we become more like Jesus, and because we become more like Jesus, we appropriate also the mission of Jesus. The mission of Jesus, which I've talked about earlier already.
Now, I just want to quickly go through key points in the last 100 years. What do we see? What similarities do we see? Firstly, we see this. In all the documents that I've quoted, there is this sense of going forward, ad gentis, from the beginning, from maximum evil right up to even Christus Vivit is talking about that we need to go forward. That it is clear that the church was intended to go forward. The church was intended to go forward for proclamation. In the first few documents, it implied that the spread of the church, spread of the faith, had been closely related to the expansion of empires, especially from Europe. But given that countries were becoming more independent and the separation between state and religion, there's now a mission in the integral growth of the faith. So the sending forth is a constant theme that one would find in all these documents. However, after Vatican II, the language seems a little bit softer. Okay? Rather than just being proclamation strictly or direct proclamation, though proclamation is not excluded, the concept of witnessing as part or as an integral part of mission and evangelization begins to take root. So witnessing becomes a very important part after the council. Second point that you see about mission is Christocentric and is also pneumatological. As I said earlier, that the mission that we're talking about, the author of the mission is Jesus himself. We are all agents. And much later, the documents will speak about how the Spirit is the one who sends people forth to mission. So there is a Christocentric, Christ-centered, a kind of a spirit authority or authorship with regard to mission. Thirdly, the third key point that we will see is the establishment of the local church. And I think this is something that slowly begins to grow. Both hierarchy and clergy. It was a theme that dominated the work of missionaries, and I'm sure many of you also have experienced this in your own life in the faith. It talks about a transition from colonial rule to independence, a transition from foreign missionaries to local clergy to religious and also lay people. I think that is an important point. Concrete proposals in some of these documents provide the directions for local clergy. So the establishment of local church, which includes the establishment of seminaries, priestly formation, methods of evangelization, lay missionaries, also begin to see in the latter part of this past century. Fourth, contextualization. In terms of the mission documents, they often respond to two levels, universal and particular. In terms of the universal, as an example would be maximum evil, responding to the post-World War I era. Subsequent documents respond to the situation of particular times. In other words, the mission documents that we have seen in the last 100 years, they are a response to what is happening in the world, and also what is happening locally to each particular area. And I think a key indication would be Amoris Laetitia, Laudato Si, Christus Vivit, responding to the challenges of this particular time with regard to family life, with regard to environment, with regard to the young. So the church somehow seems to be setting a particular direction already in terms of a mission as we look into the future. Fifth would be dialogue. Dialogue intra within ourselves and also inter with other religions, with other communities. And I think Pope John Paul II makes it very clear. This is dialogue. By dialogue, we open ourselves to one another and we open ourselves to God. And dialogue becomes a very important point also. Sixth would be human liberation and accompaniment. As I said, in Ecclesia and Oceania, we begin to see that the social activities of the church, the liberation of the human person, is very much an integral part of the mission of the church. And accompaniment. And I think an accompaniment is the vocabulary or the language of Pope Francis. Talks about with regard to families, the struggles, the challenges that they have, with regard to the environment, with regard to our young people. He calls for an accompaniment, he calls for walking with others. That's why we begin to hear words like, a pastor must, a shepherd must know the smell of his sheep, an accompaniment. And he says that the church is like a field hospital. It incorporates everyone, and we need to accompany them rather than judging others. So the idea of accompaniment. The last point is this eco-consciousness, and I think this is something that many people have read and are been sharing with one another. And I don't need to go into this in great detail. I think Laudato Si has awakened the church to the new reality of the church's mission, the care for the common home. The ecological crisis is our common responsibility, is our common mission for peace for the whole of creation. It's a document not just written for Christians or Catholics, but it is offered to the whole world. And this is part of the transforming work in the church's mission. And I've just been able to look at 5 paradigm movements, and I will bring this to a conclusion. There are 5 paradigm movements in the last 100 years. Firstly, it is from Christianity being a foreign entity, it moves towards being an indigenized church, a local church. The training of local clergy, the setting up of local seminaries, the appointment of local hierarchy, the cross-pollination between faith and culture, customs, local movements, we begin to see that it's moving from what Christianity was considered as something foreign to something being more local with the establishment of all these institutions and directions. Secondly, the movement that you see from being clergy or religious-centered church, the movements have been towards the involvement of the people of God, lay participation in the mission of the church. Every person is called to the mission of the church. It is to be shared by all the baptized. As I said, not reserved to a select few or a particular group, not just the role of the ordained or the professed, but everyone is just equally invited into the mission of the church. Thirdly, the movement sees from seeing non-believers as subjects of conversion, it moves towards to seeing others as companions or sojourners in the world, in the earth together. We are pilgrims. The others are not just subjects of our conversion. In other words, it simply means that the movements of the mission in this area are quite stark. If in the past the church had viewed non-Christians as subjects of our Christianization, we are now moved away from that. We are companions, we are collaborators, we are partners, we are pilgrims. And I think this paradigm movement provides the church with a much wider mission rather than a narrow one. Fourth, from cultural incompatibility to cultural complementarity. Prior to the 20th century, the indigenous cultures and customs were seen with great suspicion. However, in the latter part of the century, we begin to see a greater acceptance of indigenous cultures and spiritualities also. They are seen as opportunities for the gospel to take root in the new territories. Of course, inculturation with great care and sensitivities can be occasions to celebrate. Final movement would be from ecclesia-centric, whether church-centered, it moves towards a kingdom-centered mission. And I think this is very much in line with what Jesus pronounces, especially at the beginning of Mark's Gospel, that the kingdom of God is at hand. The early expressions of mission was for the purpose of expansion of the church. Most things in relation to mission activities seem to seek an internal good of the church. However, now we begin to see that the church is part of a larger entity, that the church is a part of a larger kingdom. And our mission is ultimately directed towards that kingdom. So what I would like to say is this, that if you look at all these documents and why Pope Francis has invited us to celebrate this extraordinary missionary month, this is my own reflection, my own reading, is that, and we look at all the missionary documents, is that whenever the church starts or shows signs of it being just self-referential, or it goes into a mode of self-preservation, there seems to be this call, go out, to go out. Those of you who work with computers, when your computer shuts down, unintentionally, and when you restart, one of the options that it gives is start in safe mode, isn't it? Whether you want to start in a safe mode. And I think when the church starts, or at least shows signs of it being self-seeking, self-serving, self-referential, self-preservation, these documents have come up. And I think with this call, there seems to be, for me, a sign that there are pockets or there are some signs that we are slowly becoming more and more, if I may use the word, introverted, introspection. So it is a call now to move out. So as I said, if we are to move forward, we are to ask how, why, where, and when. And I think these questions are very important. I will just read this as it is. This is the paradigm that I think we could look at, as we move forward. If we are to move away from being self-referential, self-preservation, we need to see the church as a communion with other communities. The church has to be a participatory church. The church being a dialoguing partner, and finally the church has to be prophetic. Let me just conclude with these few words. If we look at the Second Vatican Council, we know that the church is missionary by its very nature. But I think one important point that I would like to ask and share with all of you is that we need to relook at how we want to be church, and not just the activities that we are concerned with. And I think mission must not be reduced to some activity. It must be the DNA of the Christian identity. In other words, it must be who we are and not what we do. And I think there is a very important distinction when we talk about mission. It must be our identity. Very often, mission is associated with the things that we do, the activities that we do. And I just want to end with this little story, that an encounter that I had with a young person whom I've known for I've seen her grow up, and she got married about 2 years ago, and then she had a baby just the beginning of this year. And we had a conversation, and she says, "Father, I feel very insecure. I feel very down." She says, in this year, when in Malaysia, we are talking about extraordinary missionary year, I have not done anything. A very young, active youth, I have not done anything. So I just had a little conversation with her, and I think this is a reality that we deal with, that each one of us will have to find our own mission in our very existence, in our very being. And I think that comes from being created in the image and likeness of God. And mission is not just what we do, mission is what we are. And that is what the church is. The very nature of the church is this. And so it is my hope that this extraordinary missionary month will provide us the opportunity to get back to the basics of our faith, and that our relationship with God finds its meaning and sense at this particular time and in the world that we live in. We have received so graciously from God, one another. We have received the generosity of His heart, purity of mind, charity in forgiveness, and we are called to steadfastness in integrity. And with that, I wish each and every one of you a blessed, extraordinary missionary mind. Thank you.
Down. I'm not so far. So again, thank you. Let us put our hands together for Father. Yes, so thank you for trying to putting 100 years of development of idea of mission and how we look at the mission into 1 hour, exactly 1 hour. So it's hard to do, but I think it might be nicely, and I'm not sure now. So what you think? And we have still maybe.
What is mission? You spoke a lot about mission, saying that we are mission, the church's mission, but simply what does mission itself mean?
Okay, there was another hand, maybe so we'll put together and later on if you can. There was somebody else.
Oh, I thought he was going to answer it first.
So later on, so
Oh, sorry. Excuse me if I don't stand up. I'd like you to address some of the issues that were raised in Dominus Jesus, which also came up from John Paul, because you mentioned certain things like the church and the kingdom cannot be, the kingdom is broader than the church, which I think was an idea that was criticized by His Holiness in Dominus Jesus, or at least by the CDF. And also, Dominus Jesus reminded Christians that, yes, dialogue is part of our mission, talking with others, but also the offer of baptism and entrance into the church was what the church's primary mission still was. So I wonder if you could address that.
thank you. Somebody else from this side? Oh, over there.
Thank you. So we have read a lot about go forth, Agentis. So today, I would like to ask, what is the role of women? Because that is the key point of going forth to a new changes of the church in Papua New Guinea. The role of women.
So maybe you will have woman voice.
Anybody else?
One more. So,
Thank you very much for the observations and questions. It gives me great comfort to know that you are not sleeping, so at least you are awake while my presentation. Now, there are three things that have been asked. I'll take the first one. What is mission? From a philosophical perspective, it's very hard to give you a definition of what mission is. But the way I approach this particular topic is mission is something that is ingrained in each one of us. And the very basis of mission, as I said at the beginning, the anthropological vision of mission is that we have been created to go out of ourselves, to reach out. That we were not created for ourselves, that man is not the end and the goal of everything, but there is a relational dimension in each one of us. And so if we say the church is missionary by her nature, is that the church, as I said, the church is mission, the church is meant to go out. And it is not just for its own purpose, for its own existence. So the mission, we can talk about, we can add different words to describe what mission is. But at its very basis would be an idea of that going forth, going out of oneself to do whatever that is required of you. And I think that is the part of the kind of a stewardship that I talked about at the very beginning in creation itself. That in creation itself, we see God entrusting mission to the human person. That man created woman to complement and the whole of the environment to be taken care of, to be stewards. So there's a relational dimension in the whole idea of mission. I don't know if that provides you a certain direction of what I'm trying to get at. Because I don't want to confine myself to say this is mission and this is not mission. Because I think in every area, in every locality, mission in terms of its activities can be defined in many ways. But I think it's fundamentally or foundationally, it is about going out of oneself. That we exist because we need to go out. And that is why I said at the beginning, if there is no mission, there is no church. If there is no church, there is no mission. So it kind of evolves from that. I hope give you some clarity, or we can have the conversation after over coffee also. Dominus Jesus, Dominus Jesus is one of the documents that is highly talked about, debated, critically looked at. Depends how you look at. What I'm trying to get at, I think one of the all the documents that though they talk about dialogue, they do not in any way diminish the need for proclamation. So I think that is a part of that journey, that stage that each one is called. I always like to look at, going back to the passage that we're all comfortable with, go make disciples, baptize and teach. And I think the very essence of everything is that God is sending us forth, go, and to make disciples, and then to baptize, and then to teach. Four distinct actions that Jesus gives his disciples. So it does not diminish in any way the need or the necessity of proclaiming the word. But I think it is also important to see the context. Let me look at my own context. I share a little bit about my own context in Malaysia. If I were to take Dominus Jesus literally, I wouldn't be standing here before you speaking. Probably I'd be behind bars. Because there are laws in Malaysia that prevent me from proselytizing, from sharing the faith explicitly. Even giving out a brochure to a Muslim in Malaysia, I could end up in jail. So in that context, it makes us think once again, what does proclamation mean? What does proclamation mean? Traditionally, we have always been comfortable with the idea of proclaiming as, we talk to someone. And I think this saying, as one of my Franciscan, and I think there's a Franciscan Capuchin bishop here also, and he could confirm, he says this is attributed to Francis, and often he says this is Francis who said in his brothers, he says, go proclaim the gospel, if necessary, use words. I think you have heard that being said before. And I think the context that we come from is very important, how we define proclamation. So I'm saying, when presented with the opportunity, we have we need to proclaim Jesus, but we also need to be witnesses of the gospel. And I think that is something that's very important. I hope that addresses the second question. The third one, role of women. I'm not going to go into PNG because I will humbly admit I do not know the context of the church. I've been here just 2 days. So I do not know. Somebody asked me yesterday over coffee, how do you like PNG? I said, I've not seen PNG. I've only seen Port Moresby. So it's like going to Kuala Lumpur and someone tells me, I've seen the Twin Towers, and I say the Twin Towers is not Malaysia. The rest of Malaysia is quite different. So it's a bit hard. But I think if I look at the move, at the direction of the documents, the involvement of the layperson, it doesn't discriminate one against the other, whether men, women, or children, that every person is an integral part of the mission of the church. That everyone contributes his or her part in building up the church. And I always look at the idea of how one complements the other. How one complements the other. And I think that's very important in the idea of building up church. Even as priest, I've served as parish priest, and I recognize that there are many gifts that I do not have, which I need to depend on lay people, especially with finance. That is my weakest area, of trying to do the accounts every month. And I think God has a good sense of humor. Now I work in a small parish where I have to do the accounts also myself. So He's trying to teach me something that I really resisted. But I think we complement one another in the areas. And I think the important thing is about recognizing the areas that how we can complement one another. The challenge is for the church and for us, for me, I won't speak for myself, is that to recognize the areas that I'm not good at and to be able to find people to complement in the ministry. And I think that is the greatest humility that we need, to be able to recognize what some of us are not able to. And I think if we can recognize that, sometimes, my stories that I hear, maybe sometimes I also fallen. Sometimes the problem is I think I know everything and I don't. and I don't. As I said, I kind of skipped that part. I stand before you here. I don't claim to be an expert in mission, in that sense, because an expert is one who knows everything, and I don't know everything. And I'm learning a lot of things, just being here 2 days, listening to the bishops and the different areas that they serve in. I'm learning a lot, and it has enriched my own. So I understand my own limitations, and I think this is where men, women, children, young people can complement in the mission of the church, in the building up of the church, and everyone has an integral part. As I said earlier, the movement has been very clear from clergy or religious centered. The movement is very clear that it has to be a people of God, and it includes everyone in that mission. So I hope the days that you are together, you can address some of the questions how you think that women can play an important part in the building up of the church. If we can see ourselves as complementing one another, I think that's the direction that we need to move towards into building up the kingdom of God.
Once again, let us put our hands and thank you, Father Clarence, for this.